Welcome. We've got Dr. Geoff Kay presenting to the COP today. So Jeff's an ecologist with a PhD from the ANU, which I have a feeling he might have even been in the same room as Matt Hardy, who is also in the room from NRM Regions Australia while he was doing his PhD. But Geoff also has global expertise in ecological measurement, natural capital markets and biodiversity, and nature-based carbon, and has worked as a consultant and for various government agencies at the federal and sort of New South Wales level, but as well as working in academia. But today, Geoff is joining us as a landholder from the and he'll be speaking sort of on behalf of his family farm, Warminda in New South Wales, and is going to be talking to us about the property and how he's making the the environmental plantings method work in the box gum grassy woodland, which is a threatened ecological community. So thanks so much for joining us, Geoff. And yeah, if you can share your slides if you have them, then that'd be great. And otherwise, I'll leave it to you to kick off. Thanks,
No,
Geoff.
thanks, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And I think I've just shared. Can you guys let me know if they've come through or not?
They have come through, but I think they're in not presenter mode at the
All
moment.
right, thanks. Okay.
It's just, yeah,
How's that?
perfect. Thanks,
Good.
Geoff.
Great. Yeah, and it is a pleasure to come and be part of your meeting and share the story that we've got at Warminda. And just want to qualify that comment about Matt Hardy. It actually predated our PhDs. We were in our honours together, kicking feet under the desks, yeah, which was even further back. But so it's great to see some and I think you find this in this space generally. My experience is people are committed to the cause, and they've been there for a long time working in this space. And the topic I wanted to talk to you all about today, and I think, Rachel, I've got 20 minutes. Is that about right? Because I've got about that amount of slides.
Yeah, that
okay?
sounds good. Yep,
Yeah.
that'll be perfect.
Yeah, it's on a similar vein. So on our family farm, which I now manage, but when I was not the manager, but just a freeloader on the farm, it sort of started back there where we started investing in ideas of farm management. So really, this is about a story of trying to restore a critically endangered woodland ecosystem, but underneath the guise of a carbon project. And to do that, I guess I'll just give a brief introduction to my background, which is, as Rachel said, I've worked in woodland management primarily more than any other field, though. Did a fair stint in focused on faunal responses to land management with reptiles. But I've spent probably the most amount of time thinking about how do we restore ecosystems and try to get biodiverse outcomes from those areas. And I have I currently have a role with the state government in a capacity that's around ecological leadership, but also have a PhD from the Australian National University, where I focused in on really what are the ways we can improve broad-scale funding mechanisms for ecosystem restoration. And that was, I don't know if you remember, the Environmental Stewardship Program, which was a federally funded program for investing in land managers to manage box gum grassy woodland. I worked sort of in that program, but for the university, doing all the ecological monitoring to attest the values that they were trying to support through that program. So spent a lot of time doing that and analysing, in particular, the reptile responses. Was very keen to understand faunal change in paying landholders for stewardship of properties. But here, what I really wanted to focus on in this particular thing was not just the ecological outcomes, but, as a land manager, I'm very motivated by the production horizon, and in particular, the long-term sustainability of what we're about to embark on. I'm in my 40s, which means I've hopefully got another 40 years or so of leaving a bit of a legacy. So I'm sort of motivated by a longer-term view at this point still. And so this idea of growing like investing into something that might take 25 years to mature, as in a carbon project, is still very appealing, and definitely aligns with the values of what we're already trying to do at Warminda. But I just sort of, I probably am speaking to the converted here, but just with the ecologist hat on, I just wanted to talk to you really about box gum grassy woodlands as a feature. And probably the thing that is most contentious within a carbon cycle is the fact that you're trying to manage an ecosystem that is naturally sparse and open and has a prerogative to be not carbon, like not vegetated in certain parts of it. And so um, part of the challenge with um, restoring a box gum grassy woodland underneath a carbon program is that you have to sell this story of open areas being a part of the actual natural requirement for the system. So as you probably all are aware, there's only about 3% of the original extent of box gum grassy woodlands still extant across state and federal legislation. It's declared critically endangered, and the one that I'm talking about here is really the yellow box, Blakely's red gum, and white box communities, which probably a fair few of you have spent some time in. And if you haven't, then I'd encourage it. It's a beautiful system. Um, they're usually dominated by, you know, 30 meter tall eucalypts, or 15 to 30 meter tall, with equivalently wide crowns. So we're talking very large trees with very wide crowns and this is probably crucial to the idea of later in the talk where we talk about carbon. Is at maturity they get very big, but it takes a very long time to get to maturity and beyond the horizon of what someone like the accrediting bodies would probably acknowledge. Uh, there's they are dominated by a sparse shrub cover and primarily by a rich ground cover of native perennial grasses. So the diversity of these systems is definitely at the ground level, and is primarily in forbs and grasses that are essentially quite tricky to reinstate. So, to cut to it, really, the opportunity that I saw as a land manager at our property Warminda was to primarily restore box gum grassy woodland. We have, as I mentioned, as a child, or at least as a younger adult, I spent a lot of energy doing sections of the property, and I guess it sort of led me down a career of ecology and forestry. Was thinking about woodland habitats and systems, and so we've been doing planting progressively across the farm. And this image here is one of a snapshot of age classes. You can see there's old remnant trees, like the ones standing in the middle of a paddock, usually isolated. There's a big tree line you can see along the road there, which was planted in the 90s and is a classic Greening Australia kind of nearly monoculture, but it has done pretty well. A lot of black wattle in the mix there. And then there's a more contemporary planting, which is a small block sitting just to the north of that tree line, where that was done in 2010. So we've been progressively, and I put huge credit to my parents for starting this process and probably fostering the whole interest, honestly. But I've been trying to build on that, but then challenging the idea of doing this in piece versus can't we just do it to the whole farm? So, and I fully acknowledge that that's not possible for many people, but in my case, it was possible to consider restoring the entirety of the property. So that's where we're aiming for. But key to that is not just for feel goods. It's we need to generate revenue to pay a mortgage, and we also want to make sure that it's designed in a way that isn't ecologically damaging as well. And so these are the three tenets that I'm really basing my philosophy on at the farm at the moment. It's primarily, it was always going to be a biodiversity farm. The carbon is enabling it to happen through payments effectively. But then underneath that is this concept that ag production must be compatible with what we do. It won't sustain itself. I can't afford to not produce off the land. So it's a pretty common story, I'm sure, although oftentimes you'll probably see the carbon and ag production and less so the biodiversity. And that ecological tilt is really where I'm hoping you can see we're putting great effort into trying to create. So you may or may not be fully aware of the environmental planning pilot, which was a subset of the Clean Energy Regulator's emissions reduction fund allocation. So it's a project that's really focused on I guess it's a mechanism for smaller funding amounts of up to 200 hectares. So there's a cap on the size of properties that can apply, and at 50 hectares that we are at Warminda, it's eligible under that constraint. But it's really geared towards being a planting methodology that focuses in on native species exclusively, that removes a lot of auditing requirements. So everything's remotely sensed, and there's no kind of upfront cost to auditing for a participant. And also, so that makes it viable for those smaller hectares. So that's the method that we were grateful to be for it to occur around the time we were considering this work. And the method that it applies is the reforestation by environmental and mallee plantings full cam method. Really, to be eligible for carbon, these areas need to meet these criteria, which is essentially they need to be more than 2 meters in height. Then there is an onus on the 20% crown cover at maturity of these sites, and the landholder has to complete a whole bunch of other steps like eligible interest holder consent and other administrivia. The planting design is really loose. So in the probably the biggest challenge and opportunity has been within the planting guidance that the regulator stipulates, is fitting in a sensible ecological configuration that while meeting the carbon goals, actually also enables the ecological function you want to restore to a site. And this image you can see here is of a fairly uniform spacing configuration, and I'd argue that there's in a boxgum woodland a real risk that if we do things so uniformly, we will miss those opportunities for recreating the open and closed structures that some systems, like the woodlands that we work in, require. And then the other part of the planting pilot is obviously selecting your permanence periods and ensuring that whilst grazing is permitted, you do it in a way that's not detrimental to the carbon growing over time. So you probably are right across that stuff. So I just wanted to share a bit about what our experience was. So at Warminda, this is a property photo from the top of the block looking down towards the Brindabella Ranges, for those that know the Canberra Yass area. We're at 50 hectares. A lot of the prior work was done on another part of the farm, which has subsequently been sold off, which is kind of nice to think that we got in there and planted that, and then that left us with an opportunity to plant this area out as well now. It's got a history of sub and super improvement over the 50s and 60s. There's been no chemical since the 90s used across the site, and increasingly, as I've had more say in it, we've shifted more towards a rotational grazing system, which has given longer rest periods to a bit of the pastures, but there's not much native diversity there. It's primarily phalaris, a lot of just non-native species that we're working with. So it's a pretty typical paddock, I suppose. So the goals here, as I said, were woodland ecosystem reconstruction within the production setting. So we wanted to be able to, at all costs, continue grazing if required, or when we can safely return. And then we also wanted to, I'm pretty motivated by the concept of shade and ensuring that we've got plenty of cool places on the farm as well for livestock health, but also for the, the condition of the vegetation, the grassy vegetation. we also needed to actually make money. um, so the stages I went through were, I guess, we're split into three, and I'll walk you through the three. The first stage was really about registering the project, and a big part of my work was really in negotiating the terms of um, the geometry of the planting. As I mentioned earlier, the CFI planting guidelines are not overly specific on things like spacings and configurations, and they have in some ways got conflicting requirements in that 20% forest cover for many box gum woodlands actually overly dense. It doesn't match uh, the required spacings you need for a woodland ecosystem. So it's kind of contradictory to the ecological outcomes. But at the same time, I understand why you would want to overplant rather than underplant. Um, then there's also the issue that there's 200 stems per hectare, and that doesn't equate to 20% forest cover. So there's these kind of competing demands you have to be stretched between. So I'd say the first sort of recommendation is, I think, having a really robust argument or means for an argument around the intended geometry is very, very important. And it took me 3 months of back and forth with the Clean Energy Regulator to discuss my planting geometry that I felt would achieve the carbon goals, but also accelerate the ecological outcomes. Um, and eventually it was agreed, but it didn't end there. It's like even as recently as this year, I've had to draw up old documents to work with the regulator once again to justify, I guess, the configurations that we're hoping for. And to the regulator's credit, they've been really good about listening and accepting the views. But it comes from a place. I'm aware that it comes from a place of someone who's an ecologist who can challenge concepts, and it's not something that's available to all landholders. And I guess the thing that I'd like to stress about this is assisting landholders to do those negotiations and fight for those geometries that work is really important, and I think potentially a real risk for modern carbon projects if they follow verbatim the geometries that are specified, or in the case of the CFI planting guidelines, they were really not that specified at all. So there are some assumptions in those that I think could be challenged. And so, yeah, this stage was really about negotiating with often. Actually, I found a lot of the people in the regulator's office were energy people. They weren't people versed in land management. So that was quite a challenge as well, was trying to talk to them about ecosystem reconstruction in the language that made sense. Then there's also all the steps of, it took about another further 6 months to achieve project registration, permanence plans, and eligible interest holder consent for the property. But eventually we got there, which was great. And so we were able to warm up the tractors and start all the site prep. So stage 2 was the site preparation, and that actually is, for me, one of the most important parts. It took 3 years, and it's probably still ongoing, if I'm honest. Between 2021 and 2023, it coincided with the La Nina event, which created challenges, but a phenomenal amount of vegetation growth. And what you're looking at is primarily phalaris, and it's challenging to plant and expect success in phalaris, but we nuked it. We essentially took, over those 3 years, 6 passes of spray and slashing to return those sites to a colonizable state. And there's a whole bunch of technical efficiencies we gained by doing it in the geometry that we did, so that we could leverage things like boom spray widths and minimal passes up and back to make sure we've got we really worked hard to find the efficiencies. So we wanted to know how, with the constraints of the 20% forest cover, also what a box gum woodland typically requires in terms of its ecology, how could we recreate that with enough redundancy in the planting to make sure that if we get losses, that we're covered for those losses. But then also a key thing is that production. So we've done this in a means that allows for future grazing business as well. underpinning the trees as they grow, as would be the one of the sensible I guess approaches for most landholders to need to do. So this is sort of the property here. That area that I was talking about before that was planted in 2010 is that area north of the dam you can see in the center of the screen. And this is sort of what it looked like after the 3 years of work, which was a really massive task. But I think if you don't do the site prep, you may as well not do the project, because there's so many things working against you. I've learned in this process. Even now, we've got roos everywhere. It's nearly impossible to keep what I thought were very sure bet trees going. There's been a heap of challenges along the way. So the site prep only helps you sort of achieve that goal. But across the 50 hectares, we've now planted out 43 hectares, which, is probably going to reflect one of the biggest remnant blocks in the whole district by the time we're finished. It's really overstory and midstory. I don't want to overstate the ground cover bits. I haven't got to the ground cover bits yet, and the plan is there to be able to start returning some species there, but we're really focused on the midstory and overstory at this point of our restoration cycle. Heaps of challenges. The tractor wheel fell off while I was slashing, and anyway, plenty of bogged situations that made it difficult. And then the stage 3 is the seeding. So, we basically had, I compiled a mix of species that would be sensible to plant. We sowed in September. Direct seeding was the approach we took, but since then I've had to follow up for 2 years worth of tube stock infill planting as well. So we got some lessons there about the success. I mean, I thought I've had enough direct seeding experience to think it was more or less a sure bet over the medium term, but even then I've been surprised at what hasn't germinated. And if I'm honest, I kind of wish that I'd probably done a combination of tube stock and direct seeding at the start. Though, yeah, it was beautiful to just do the direct seeding in one afternoon. It was really good. So, here are the species that we've used, and here are some images of the species as they've sort of been tracking along in those species, over the time. So this is 1 year on. We're seeing some, nice eucalypt and wattle recruitment occurring in those seeded areas. I noticed just the other day that some of the flowering already. So that's been really good. So, the main message I really wanted to convey is that I think the geometry, like arguing for a specific geometry, is crucial. It's missing in most carbon guidance, the ecological considerations of how you structure your planting are very important and often simplified. So I think a species vegetation class level of consideration of planting geometries is really important, and it can be agreed. Like, my experience is that the regulator listened, and it was really heartening. Although there was really robust conversations about that, it was heartening to see that there was an avenue there for us to take the CFI guidelines and adapt them with justification. The other thing is really just about the site prep, just making sure that that there's plenty of site prep there on the way. And so now, I guess what we're up to now, and the final slide is that I'm now working with a group of about 27 farmer groups that to support them in their project registration. So like I said, I'm fortunate in that I had the ecological training to argue some of these points, but most landholders don't. And having that capacity to be able to assist them in their project applications, and also to be able to come up with and lobby for certain planting geometries, I think is something that's really benefited all of these groups that we're working with across box gum grassy woodlands, mainly because there's a tension between the need for carbon versus the need for the ecological outcome. And more carbon does not equate to better biodiversity outcomes. And trying to set out what that looks like in a carbon registration project was not easy, and it remains to be seen about how well successive governments continue to, I guess, entrust those decisions to landholders versus just look at the legislation and say you didn't plant to this configuration as required by our legislation, therefore it's not a successful project. So um, that's something that I remain a bit on edge about, but ultimately, so far the experience has been good to work, work out what I think is going to be a really enduring planting design. I mean, it's gonna have open areas in it, and those open areas will allow for seed fall over time, which will ultimately infill, but it does it in a most efficient way so that we're not driving up and down and spraying every single portion of the property. So that's really all I had for slides, but happy to take any comments or questions along the way if anyone has any. So thanks very much for the opportunity once again
That's
to share the story.
that's great. Thanks, Geoff. I'm really interested in the project and I've written down some questions, but I'll go to the floor first because that's the polite thing to do. So, COP members, does anyone have a question for Geoff straight up? Please unmute and feel free to jump in if you've got one.
I do, Rach.
Thanks, Russ. Go for it.
Yeah, that was great, Geoff. It's really good to hear some practical um, application of the things in place, the carbon credit system in place. I'm just wondering how much effort you put into the economic side of it, and how you're balancing the ag production with the carbon expectations down the track.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I'm fortunate to have a dual income situation, so I don't have to rely on the revenue from the farm, but I have a philosophical position more than anything around ensuring that it pays its own, and that there is this, and I've got an eyes wide open approach to the fact that that this can only really work on scale if people can make this a business, you know. And um, my approach is that I guess I wanted to. So we do have a financial model. The financial model of we've been working with a group called the STAR, the Southern Tablelands Restoration Group. We've pulled together a kind of a model that is a collective of 10 landholders in the district, and we've tried to map out all of the financial stages required. So we've got some numbers around that, but I guess to boil it down, it's really about two things, really, in my mind. It's leveraging your own time and resource. Like, if I costed this out as a contractor, it would be insurmountable, I would suggest, given the amount of time I spent on a tractor and trying to troubleshoot. So I think this works well when you've got the ability to do it yourself. I mean, I'm sure it can work if you don't, but it's just far more marginal kind of business. And the other thing about it is, I guess, the method of planting. So we've been, like I said, testing the cheaper end, which is the direct seeding end of broad scale restoration. And past experiences, like as in from 10 years ago, it looked like that's all we needed to do in this country. It was very good return. This time around, I'm not so sure. Like this time, I'm not seeing a lot of germination in some lines that I would expect to, and I can't really explain it other than kangaroo browsing. So we're going to have. So I've already spent 2 years sort of infilling, which has cost me a lot of time. We have done some wonderful things. Like I've tried my best to keep costs down, but we've relied on, like, we had a school group out the other day. The kids ran out in the lines and they all planted trees, and it was really quite a great community event. Like, it was very well. So far we're managing it that way, but
Child labour's the answer. Is that what you're
child
saying,
labour,
Geoff?
and yeah, just that's been possible at this scale. But I imagine if you go, and even at 50 hectares, that's still a massive area to deal with. And but obviously it becomes untenable at scales even larger than that. So that I think the thing think about is when you design your tree planting lines, make sure you build in that redundancy. And we did that. We made sure that we could allow for space for a direct seeder to fill in between the gaps. It was amazing how quickly those, despite 3 years of spraying and slashing and heavy treatment, it was amazing how quickly they became unplantable again. It was like 3 months we got. After 3 years of work, it was a 3 month window. And then it was all really cooch again on top of it, and just really like difficult veg. So that was a real learning. Was it really matters that you design your plantings in such a way that they can leverage the site prep you have been doing in a way that for us we were able to drive a direct seeder right down the middle of the existing 2 rows to infill planting as well in a cheap, like in an efficient way, and hopefully. Because the seedings will have different success at different seasons. The best case scenario probably would be to plant in autumn and also in spring. Really test the limit, like give yourself all options for germination to occur. If it fails, then return again with a direct seeder, and it should, like that would be, one way to do it. The other way, becomes far more expensive quickly with having to tube stock plant, in those areas. But by not considering redundancy in your planting, you simply would have to start from scratch again, which in many cases would just be impossible to consider.
Thanks, Geoff. So just on that, in terms of the planting density, because in the intro you were talking about how it's meant to be 200 stems per hectare that you put in. Is that what you planted in the end? Like, did it work out, but you just planted them in strips? You sort of did strip planting? And was it a block planting or was it
It's a block planting design, and I couldn't tell you how many trees because it's direct seeding. So I know that there's hundreds of seeds per meter. So I know that I've well eclipsed the 200 stems per hectare in terms of what was planted, but in terms of what comes up, we definitely don't have that in lengths of strips, and we definitely do have that in other lengths of strips. So on balance, we're aiming, and the infill planting is tasked with trying to maintain at least 200 stems per hectare. But actually, in talking to the regulator, it seemed it wasn't so much about that part of the ledge as the 20% forest cover. So lack of certainty around the actual requirement, because those two things are very different, was something we needed to overcome. And I'm much more motivated by the 20% forest cover than the 200 stems per hectare.
Yeah, because the stems per hectare, now tell me if this is right, is more about how full cam is calibrated, and the 20% cover is in the legislated method.
That's right. And so the legislation is ultimately the decider. But this is part of the regulator's discussion was, not all systems require 200 stems per hectare. Not even all forest systems would require that. But certainly for open boxgum woodlands, you don't want that much in a mature state across the whole extent of the property. So we talked I worked a lot with the regulator about changing their scale of assessment and their risk and auditing approach to one of a broader scale, so that we can capture the heterogeneity of the planting densities, rather than look at a very granular scale and say fail, fail, pass, fail, fail, pass with their spatial imagery. So it's really important to consider, the heterogeneity of those systems in terms of the forest cover, as part, and not make it in default of the legislation. So and the other, what was the other thing I meant to say about sorry, back to the other question about the farming, like the economic viability of it all. We've had to destock, and every iteration and failure you face is another few years of destocking you have to do. And so that's really, also we're fortunate in that I have off-farm income, but for people who are relying on that grazing, I can see why that's not an option.
Have we got more questions from the floor? Thanks for that answer, Geoff. Who else has got a question?
I've got a couple, but one of them has sort of already been answered. But Geoff, I guess my brain's going to how do we enable this sort of stuff at scale? as much as we'd all like Geoff Kay's in our neighborhood, that's probably not going to happen. But yeah, I guess in terms of getting out the plantings, like what's your advice to landholders and neighbors and extension officers and stuff out there who are kind of trying to push this barrow?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see how it's not appealing to many people. Like, my advice is that I think the thing that really holds people back primarily um, is lack of certainty from the rules. Is knowing how to uh, it all seems too much unless you're willing to kind of come in with the prior knowledge. So I'd say those discussions with the regulator are really important. I'd say another thing holding people back is really just not knowing. So, this, and that's why we've started working with all these farmer groups, is just to try to help support them with that part of the registrations process, so that uh, they're no longer uh, stretching beyond their something that they know in terms of farm management, and they're entrusting that ecological design and configuration part to others. So I think that's a necessary move. The other thing is understanding that the regulator, in my experience, has been really open to listening, and I think it's the frustration though, and the thing holding a regulator back is possibly that um, it seems to be that their guidelines are open, which covers their bases, but doesn't provide much assurance for landholders who want to know really what are they signing up for in terms of spacings and geometries. So um, having like I would be a fan of more clear cut planting guidelines, especially for open closed woodland systems. Systems that are quite different to forest systems would make a lot of sense. So I've been trying to make some suggestions like this to the regulator to say, why don't you just have an addendum to your um, um, to your guidelines, CFI guidelines that really suit a more open-closed woodland system, and it wouldn't take much to draft that, and it really wouldn't be very hard to change your risk perspective. Like you're trying to audit these, well then you just audit at a different scale.
Mm.
Yeah, so but I can't really do. Yeah, I'm not sure what the future of that really is. Like, I don't know how much the regulator is keen on that. Other than that, at the moment they're approving projects by projects, so it's not kind of systematic. And it would be much more comforting for people, I think, if they had that invested drafting of the guidelines clearer up front, so
Yeah,
that you can
got
just
the
apply,
certainty.
without having
Mm.
to lobby or negotiate or fight for different outcomes.
For sure. Does anyone else from the COP have a question for Geoff? Joshua, go for it.
Thanks, Geoff. Great presentation. I guess because I think your point you hit there is around the regulator, and obviously you've done your negotiation at your project level, which you've also referred to other people doing the same. Has there been discussions with the regulator to lift up your discussions in other project by project discussion to capture those things? Because I guess
Yeah,
that's the point. Is everyone's doing negotiations and you're spending
yeah.
so much time, and what's the process to lift up those negotiations to get them to review those guidelines if that's the approach that's possible?
I've
Great
certainly
question.
I've certainly suggested it, Joshua. Like, but that's sort of as far as I'm able to take it at a project level. It probably
Maybe
does. It will take. I think it probably would. I mean, I'd be certainly happy to contribute some thoughts towards, some recommendations to the regulator's approach. But I
sounds
haven't
like you
been
need to
asked.
send Rachel all the notes for her to put a paper together.
Yeah, and Rachel, there's others too that are really interested in, like I know that Regen Farmers Mutual and groups like this are also really keen to kind of enable
Mm,
broad scale restoration through the box gum belt as well. And this is, certainty around the planting guidance and the case we've taken and are demonstrating at Warminda is kind of like the heart of the matter. It's just simply to say, if we were to follow the regulators' guidelines as they are currently drafted, we would not end up with the ecological outcomes that we want. And if you trust us to tweak them, then we will. And at the moment, that's happening project by project, and it needs to be. It would help the regulator immensely, I think, if it wasn't project by project, and that they were able to update the guidance documents.
Yeah.
My second question was more around, so obviously you're working with about 27 farmers, is that correct?
At the moment,
yeah. I guess of those 27, what's the percentage who are not sold on the idea, and are there issues, the things you've just discussed, or they're different? What's the rate of, what's the percentage uptake of those 27 you're working with, I guess?
Yeah, well, so it's kind of biased because it's already talking about those that are interested in registering projects. I couldn't tell you how many weren't interested to a point, but of those, I would say the planting geometry is a major sticking point. Understanding how to design a carbon, none of those are really, their challenge has been none of those seem to want to proceed under the current planting geometries the regulator imposes. So that's why we're working with them, is to try to help draft up those sections of their registrations and also to provide that ecological guidance around how you would achieve both the carbon outcome and the ecological outcome, and ultimately the production outcome as well.
So that would be a lot to do that geometric assessment.
I mean, but there's tricks too. So a woodland is a woodland effectively. So it's just that this approach for carbon restoration works very well in those woodland systems, and it's probably the main player. I think if you were able to make the changes we've been able to do at Warminda at scale, I think you would very easily make this economically viable, because primarily you're not asking a landholder to become a forester straight away. You're asking them to remain being a grazier, and it's about trying to ensure that grazing remains relevant in those systems by allowing for those open areas that also serve ecological functions. But that's happened to also be grazable, which is good from a landholder's perspective.
And when are you hoping to be able to graze them, Geoff? I was interested in the how long you might have exclusion, because I think others who were at the conference, and also we've had Raf would present to this group before, but there's a few models like Silver Capital doing a lot of carbon projects across the country and looking to have these sort of biodiverse plantings, but the grazing livestock underneath. So how do they work together in the system? You said you've completely excluded stock. We couldn't see a cow or a sheep in sight in the images. So what's the reintroduction
well, at the
plan?
moment, in those images, they were a concentrated herd, and they weren't in the they were in those some of those images. But look, I've got 10 years as a notional idea. I think I want, you don't want to go all this work only to have it trashed at the end. It's already hard enough to keep the kangaroos off. So honestly, if I'm honest, I'd be very happy to never have to graze those areas again. But I think 10 years is probably safe enough expectation. People say shorter periods, and in my experience, everything has to be going right for you to achieve that. Whereas I think 10 years is more realistic that you're going to get recruitment. We've got a lot of smaller plants in the mix. Our species mix is very ecologically relevant. And so, you've got small things. A lot of the smaller wattles would very easily get damaged. They're never going to get to a height that's, a big steer can't knock over within that time frame. So, but, my background is working in woodlands across the state. I've seen many effective cases of rotational grazing work compatibly with high quality functioning woodland ecosystems as well. So our goal is to, although we don't really have the species inherent at the site, we'd have to reintroduce them, being primarily improved pastures. Our hope is that the grazing will actually enable more recruitment, and we'll be able to use the grazing for better ecological outcomes by opening up some of the competition of the phalaris and things like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Geoff. Is there a final question for Geoff before we let him go? I think we've got it. Who else had a burning question? Rhiannon.
I had one, Rachel.
Jump
I
in.
didn't know it was burning, and thanks, Geoff. I'm sorry if I missed it. I was wondering if you have, you've just talked about the work you're doing in woodlands around restoration and productivity. Wondering if you've got references or evidence that we could draw on. So, looking at the balance between trees and vegetation restoration and production land for grazing.
It's probably the best thing to draw upon would be, well, yeah, I guess I've got some papers. I mean, I can send through that we published based on land management of high quality woodland patches. So these were patches that were eligible for the environmental stewardship program that the Commonwealth sent, and you know, on site there's a variety of quality, but generally they're all at least moderate to high quality woodland remnants. And you know, a lot of the work we were able to show there, you know, did a lot of work on grazing, where we set up a 96 plot grazing trial right across the Burra region, which we surveyed for 6 years for invertebrates, mammals, reptiles, birds, soils, and vegetation, and we're able to analyse that, you know, the wide variety of outcomes from grazing to those particular systems. So there's definitely some data sets there to draw upon from those areas. As a rule, that I mean, I know that like for example, the Fenner School at the ANU does a lot of work as well in woodland that would support the science behind the presence of trees and the ecological relationships with areas underneath the trees versus the open areas. But it might not be quite what you're asking. I think you're thinking of more production-based
Are you
data.
thinking about
right?
the trade-off? Yeah, Rhiannon.
I'm thinking about some of the data that's come out of farming for the future, where there is a volume of trees, or there is a density and a cover of trees that is the sweet spot for production and resilience in the farm, where the farm is primarily a productive, like it's a grazing system. So there's a point where ecosystem services and natural capital contribute to increased productivity, and then when density gets over that, it becomes more around, I suppose, conservation and habitat restoration and maybe carbon projects, and maybe less about the agricultural production. And the reason that I'm asking is I always want that bit of gold that says to the farmers, we can have our cake and eat it too. So we want to champion vegetation and sequestration and services on farms, but we've got to be realistic around those production goals.
But I think probably the best plot that comes to mind, and I could probably send it through, Rhiannon, is the one of the stem densities plot. So you and vegetation types, and open and closed box gum woodlands sit well below. Like from all monitoring we've ever done of woodlands, it never exceeds about 100 to 150 stems per hectare. You know, for a nice, well-functioning box gum woodland. So straight there is your evidence to say this requirement of both the 20% forest cover, if you consider most woodlands to be about 30%, you know, open, and the 200 stems per hectare requirements don't meet the requirements for some of those open vegetation classes. That's the sort of data I think you would argue. And then you would say, so for landholders who are in those landscapes, which is a large part of sort of central New South Wales, for example, they need a different product, or at least they need this negotiated product that is to enable carbon in those open areas. And to me, it's been, we've demonstrating it here, but it's very possible to refine the geometry to enable those open areas, but increase the densities in the rows so that you're not compromising the carbon. You're just not doing it in a grid-based pattern. You're doing it in a way that's more complex and I guess integrates that open and closed pattern you would see in nature. Yeah, so that yeah, but yeah, there's probably not a lot of. Yeah, I don't know if you can sort of. Yeah, I'm not aware of any data that sort of says, these densities of carbon, you have these sort of outcomes because it's just so dependent on the vegetation type that you're in as well.
Great. Thanks, Geoff, and thanks everyone for the questions.